Okay, I will start. Please, Julieta and Cristóbal could keep the video on, but for the others, it is better if you switch it off. We are recording the session, and I just want to say a few words of welcoming to our guests and also welcoming to the public, but also introduce the Cosmos Roundtables this event is part of, and introducing the topic of today's encounter. So this is the second Cosmos Roundtable of this new academic year, and we had the first one on the American election with Ken Roberts and Sidney Tarro, and we are going to have another one on Bolivia next week. We are going to have this one on Chile, the constitutional referendums and the constitutional process. I think it is not by chance that we are going to have these three on the American continent, because so many things are happening there and so many things that address the core interest of our departments in terms of relationship between institutional politics and contentious politics. The challenge of the pandemic is also an opportunity for this type of roundtable, because they allow us to organize international events with the best possible participants and to open it to the participations of colleagues from different countries. So it is a pleasure to have with us to discuss about the erasing of the Pinochet constitution in Chile and the constitutional process, to have with us Julieta Suárez-Cao, who is associate professor at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile and belongs to the red Politólogas, No Sin Mujeres. She is an expert in comparative politics, on federalism, the electoral system, women politics, but also human rights. And thank you, Julieta, very much for having accepted to participate. And we have another very important and welcome speaker, Cristóbal Rovira Kaltwasser, who is the director of the Instituto de Investigación en Ciencias Sociales de la Escuela de Ciencias Políticas de la Universidad Diego Portales. He is a leading expert on populism, party change, right-wing challenges, and the effects of these transformations on democracy, and he has written broadly on this topic. There are many reasons why we are interested in what is happening in Chile. First of all, as citizens, we have an interest in the development of democratic politics, but also Chile is best examples of the interactions between social movements and constitutional processes that we have been studying, researching, and debating in recent time, looking at other examples like the Icelandic case, the Irish case, and so on. So it is what we want to discuss, a first step of so-called national plebiscite that has approved the drafting of a new constitutions with 78% of the votes, and that this drafting should happen through a new constitutional convention that is going to be elected soon. So we are, to a certain extent, in an important moment, but also at the beginning of a process that implies a new election of the constitutional convention in April, and then the referendum in August 2022. What is interesting, particularly for us, is that, as Cristóbal was mentioning before, the key role in this process have been played by social movements and civil society organizations through the development of a wave of protest that we were already studying. And Enrico Padoan is with us. He's one of those who have been studying it already before the constitutional process. So it was pushed by a wave of protest that raised on relatively minor issues, the increasing subway fare in the Santiago metro. So it's similar to the Brazilian case of a few years ago. But these issues was linked to strong inequalities, privatization policies, and political problems that had emerged already long before. This wave of protest developed in a moment in which there was a global wave of contestations. It was in October 2019 that the first fare evasion campaign was started by high school pupils and students. And very quickly, this developed into large demonstrations with millions in the streets, with repression, state of emergencies, curfew, and the arrest of many people. Also, people lost their life in the streets. But together with repressions, there was also the political response that brought about the constitutional process. So in October already, some ministers of the government were dismissed and promises were made of reform in the area of education, healthcare, pensions, and so on, that reflected the claims of the protesters. It was called the Chilean Spring, but it reminded also of something that had happened 50 years before, the long autumn of 1969 in Italy, which was also characterized by innovative protest, massive participations, the capacity to connect different types of claims, and organizational networking. This is a protest that also built upon previous path-breaking moment of contestations, like the one we have studied also at Cosmos, the student protest in their different ways. And it is a protest that was addressing the most cruel neoliberal experiments in Latin America, but also maybe worldwide, and also long-standing issues related with the negotiated transitions to democracy after Pinochet. Finally, it comes in a moment in which, after the revival of the left in Latin America and after the backlash against this revival, new victories for progressive forces are happening, first in Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile is also interesting in this process of resistance to the backlash. So for us, it is interesting for the constitutional process. It is interest because it is related with the massive wave of protest, because of the legacies of the student protest, and because of the process of democratic deepening that it can bring about. So I want to ask two sets of questions to Julieta and Cristóbal. And the first is about the conditions for this change. What allowed to erase the Pinochet constitutions? what has been the role of progressive social movements, the strategies that proved so effective, and how did the scaling up of the protest from the fear of public transports into constitutional politics happen, and especially how could this type of challenging moments be developed during the pandemic. So thank you. Maybe Julieta would like to start on this.
Thank you, Donatella. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be in the Scuola Normale talking about Chile. It is powerful to think about the erasure of Pinochet's constitution. I've been in Chile for 10 years, and this happened really quickly. But as you say, there are some conditions or antecedent conditions that we can think of. What permitted that the social uprising ended up being hopefully institutionally channeled through a constitutional convention. So I think that first, we cannot ignore the proposal of constitutional reform advanced by Michelle Bachelet in her second administration. This process included citizens' assemblies, local participatory mechanisms that I believe were key to many of the current developments. It was then by no means like a massive event in terms of number of participants, but I think it was widely known by the population. And then when Piñera won the election, he announced very clearly that the reform of the constitution was no longer an issue in his government, and that he was not going to push forward that. But then the social uprising last year put it back on the agenda. So I would say, like, we have this, I don't call it failed experiment, but this experiment during the latest Bachelet administration that put, in a way, a reform of the constitution in the cognitive map of the Chilean society. I would also say that we've seen some kind of renovation in the right. And we conducted a survey with 2 other colleagues among center-right party elites in 2017. And we found there that the new party on the right, the center-right, the new party Evópoli, most of its elites were in favor of changing the constitution. And that was a breaking point within the right. The right was sided with dictatorship, with Pinochet, with the constitution, with the neoliberal society, or with the neoliberal economy. Evópoli respected completely the neoliberal economy, but they were more open about thinking changes in democratic ways, like to disowning, in a way, the inheritance of the dictatorship. So I think that was important. Also, in that survey, we found, like, I think that was a surprising finding for us, that almost a third of center-right and right party elites were in favor of a more active state intervention in the economy. And we didn't expect that. And I think that is important, because after the social uprising, the most important figures on the right that we see now that are leading public opinion polls for the elections in November, the presidential elections in November, are this new type of, I'm not that new, but this type of more like social Christian or right leaders that have what we call a solidarity sensitivity, and they favor stronger state intervention. So some kind of a departure from the neoliberal model that Chile is famous for. So I would say that Bachelet and some kind of changes or renovation within the right are important antecedent conditions to understand why the demands of the social uprising were able to be channeled through a constitutional convention now. But the protests and demonstrations in Chile did not begin last year. As Donatella was saying, the student movement in 2006 and 2011 had already fought for free, higher quality, quality for higher education. Other social groups were organized against the pension fund administrators and the privatization of the pensions. There were other movements at the regional level with environmental claims. And I would say that Chile did not seem so, but it was a very lively social society. But then in 2018, I think another important antecedent was the feminist movement. The feminist movement took the street in what was called the May of 2019 and took universities as well to demand an end to sexual violence, to non-sexist education. And this movement showed a new organization of protest. It was not like the student movement that have the leadership and those leaders went to Congress, they are deputies now, or even some regional and environmental movements in the south of the country. The feminist movement was a completely different type of social movement. So there was no leadership, a lot of horizontality among its members, and many of these characteristics are shared with the protests of the social uprising, or the protest of 2019. So I think it was a way to show that there was a different fashion that you can put together, you can organize a social movement that was kind of different from the social movements of the past in a way. And also, the social uprising then in 2019 were not immediately met by the government with an institutional solution. This came after a month of non-stopping protests, escalation of violence, but neither repressive methods that were used a lot, such as military curfew and police brutality, nor the lukewarm reform agenda introduced by the Piñera administration were enough to bring about some kind of order or like social peace. So many of the demands pushed by the protesters were not possible to enact under the current constitution. But I don't know if we can say that protests move from specific claims into constitutional issues in a bottom-up fashion, or if it was more like a top-bottom solution, the only institutional solution that could channel the discontent and also provide an institutional outlet to articulate these different demands that were really diverse and were many of them. So once the constitutional road was in place, I would say that progressive social movements started to follow at least two different strategies. First, feminist and indigenous groups pushed for descriptive representation in the Constitutional Convention. I was involved in this process with other colleagues of the Red de Politólogas, the network of women political sciences, and we managed to design an electoral system for the Constitutional Convention that guarantees gender parity. And as a result, Chile will be the first country in the world to have a constitution drafted by men and women in equal proportion. Nowadays, indigenous people movements are still fighting for reserved seats in the Constitutional Assembly. It should be solved next week. We'll see. We're still in the middle of the fight. But then progressive social movements also started advancing an agenda of substantive reforms to include in the Constitution, from the establishment of a plurinational decentralized state, introduction of gender mainstreaming in all state structures, the incorporation of human rights and non-discriminatory international treaties to the Constitution. So, and then some of the movements are relying on independent candidates to the convention to push their agenda from the inside, but they are also fighting for the enactment of participatory mechanisms in the assembly. They want that organized social groups have an input on the discussion about the Constitution during the convention as well. So in this sense, even though we find that protests diminished during the pandemic, I think they didn't disappear. Some of them went online, for instance, and they started re-emerging little by little when lockdown provisions were lifted. And I personally don't expect social pressure, I don't know if protest, but at least social pressure to dwindle after the referendum. I believe that social actors and movements in Chile learned from the past. They were instrumental in the transition to democracy, but once civilians took office, they sent social movement back home. Okay, we have democracy now. Go to your home. But I believe that now they will not trust politicians again, and they do not feel that their job is done with the election of conventional delegates, and that's why they want to participate in some way, or they want to have their input heard in the Constitutional Convention.
Thank you very much, Julieta. Cristóbal, please.
Thank you, Donatella, and thank you also for the invitation, for being virtually in Italy at the moment, and also for sharing this table with Julieta, who is someone who really knows and has been involved in the process. So about the question about the conditions, I mean, some of the ideas that I'm going to develop are very similar to the ones that Julieta have already mentioned, but probably I will emphasize certain issues that she didn't put too much emphasis, mainly I think also because of issues of time. I mean, the first argument that I want to develop is something that Julieta already mentioned, and having Sidney Tarrow here sharing the table with us in the audience, I will use his concept of social movement society. And Chile is the best example of that. I mean, Chile has become a social movement society in the sense that social movements are extremely active, and they are challenging the political establishment in many different ways. I mean, Julieta already mentioned the issue that we have had the student movement that has been very powerful in the last few years, but there is also this movement against the pension system that started to gain a lot of traction. There is also the feminist movement, we have ecologist movements, etc. And of course, we have this wave of protests. I'm talking to Donatella, this is very obvious. It's not that the social movements are every day on the streets, but depending on the issues and the political agenda, they gain saliency or not. But this has been a process that we have been seeing in the last 10 to 15 years. So in this sense, this is something important to keep in mind. So as Julieta was saying, so civil society is back in town, social movements are back in town. And in contrast to the previous experience of civil society, I think one of the main differences is the current actors, they know that they need to remain active. Because if they go back home, there is a big chance that the process are going to be controlled by the elite again, and the outcome, it's not going to be necessarily the best one. The second argument that I want to develop is something that Julieta didn't mention, but I think it's important to consider. And this is a sort of a paradox of the Chilean case that I think makes the situation of the country very interesting in a comparative perspective. And the argument that I want to develop is that everybody knows that Chile is characterized by extremely high levels of socioeconomic inequality, and this has to do with the implementation of the neoliberal model. But what is interesting is that if you have a look at the empirical data that we have for the last few years, income inequality has been declining. This is a paradox. If you look to the Gini index, which normally economists look at, Gini index went down in the last few years. It's still massive if you compare that with many European countries, but it has been going down. And despite of declining socioeconomic inequality, you have this huge social movement protesting against inequality. And I think this is important because it reveals again that the issue is the repoliticization of inequalities. And this repoliticization of inequalities has not been done by political parties, but it has been done by civil society and social movements. And when I'm talking about repoliticization of social inequalities, it's not only socioeconomic issues, it's also issues related to gender, for example, as Julieta was mentioning there, or also issues related to the environment. And I think this is crucial because these social movements that have been emerging in the last few years and that have been repoliticizing these issues of inequalities have been very useful in the sense of trying to tell to society that there are some specific claims. There is a specific issue about education. There is a specific issue about gender inequality. There's a specific issue about environment. But all these things are related to a certain extent to the institutional setting that we have in Chile. And this is why this repoliticization of inequality has been extremely productive in the sense of trying to show that this is related to the necessity of changing the current constitution. So this is a second dimension that is important to mention. The third argument that I want to develop is something that Julieta mentioned already, and this is the reaction of the government. Of course, we cannot know what would have happened if the government had reacted in a different way, but the government reacted in the worst ways that you can imagine. I mean, I don't know if people that are hearing are familiar, but when the social outbreak happened, and we are talking about massive, I mean, we're talking about millions of people on the streets, the president of the country went to the poshest neighborhood in Santiago to eat a pizza. So you can imagine, I mean, I was watching the news and I thought, there is no someone who is working with this guy telling him, this is not the best thing that you should do. And what it's even funny or tragedy, however you call it, is that when he says, okay, I was at the pizzeria, they ask him, so why did you do it? Well, it was the birthday of my grandson, and I want to be with the people that love me. So you're saying your country is literally burning. You're one of the richest guys of the country, and you go to eat to a pizzeria in one of the poshest neighborhoods of the country. It's a sign that you're not really understanding what is going on. And 2 days after, there's this famous speech that he gave on TV in which he claims that Chile is at war. So, and when you hear that, you're saying if Chile is at war with your own citizens, this is, of course, this whole reminiscence about military dictatorship, because if the country is at war, this is a civil war, so the only way is that you start killing your own people, or what's the way out? So, but this again shows something that is important to consider, that a big chunk of the Chilean right, not the whole right, as Julieta was saying, but a big chunk of the Chilean right is completely detached from the problems of Chilean society. And Piñera, in fact, he thought, and the people that are working with him at the beginning, that this was an issue only of public security. And he thought that he will mobilize the military, that people will say, oh, finally, we have someone who is going to be strong enough to put pressure and tell all these protesters that they should go home. And if not, we'll use like law and order. But this was a completely misreading of the situation, because we are talking about of hundreds of millions of people on the street. And he didn't react in the best way, quite the contrary. And this helped up for scaling up the process, because people were saying, so if these are the guys that we have in government, we have to tell them that the problem is much bigger than what they are thinking. So in this sense, the bad reaction of the government helped to the scaling up of this movement that started as something only, I would say, related to the metro price, but it started to grow up. And because of the very bad reaction of the government, civil reaction started to react in the scaling up process that put so much pressure on the street that at the end of the day, the only way out for the government was to go through the Constituent Assembly process. And here comes my fourth and last point that connects with the argument of Julieta. This is because the right started, probably for the first time, I would say, in a very evident way, started to divide. There was this tension between the right that normally has been a quite monolithic bloc, but now there were certain actors within the right that they realized that the only way out, not only for the crisis of the moment, but also in the long-term perspective, that the only way out is to adapt to the necessities of Chilean citizens. And when I say the necessities of Chilean citizens, and we have discussed it with Julieta in other sessions, is that Chilean citizens don't want to have Venezuela. They don't want to build North Korea. They don't want to have like Venezuela. What Chilean citizens want is a mild sort of social democratic model. I mean, this is the only thing that they want. It's not too much. But of course, if you are a deep neoliberal, this means rebuilding the whole system. But as said, there are certain sectors of the right that already understood that the only way to remain competitive in the electoral arena is to adapt to that scenario. And this is why Piñera, at the end of the day, decided, okay, the only way out it's to do that. And then the soft liners, so to say, within the government started to play a bigger role. And as Donatella mentioned, one of the issues of that was a reshuffling of the cabinet. And the reshuffle of the cabinet meant giving more power to the soft liners. And this paved the way, to a certain extent, for the constituent process. But of course, it's still an open question, and probably we can debate that in the next round of questions. What will happen with this tension within the right? Because this is something that it's happening at the moment, and it's very unclear how it's going to be unfold. It could be that they can still keep together, or it could be that they really fragment into different factions. But this, of course, we'll see what happens in the next few months and years.
Thank you very, very much to both. There are already many interesting ideas on the table. I would like just to ask a second round of questions, which relate very much with the ending points of both interventions, and it is about what's going to happen. Because already in the past, with the ousting of Pinochet, there was clearly divisions, but then the compromise was such that apparently the many problems remain open, including the problem of the Pinochet constitutions. Now, you both said there have been broad coalitions, and the pressures from the civil society brought about the divisions between softliner and hardliner. But what will happen now that the decisions is no longer the erasing of the old constitutions, but the writing of a new one? First of all, which are the important tipping points in the next steps? How will progressive forces, actors be able to affect the results of the constitutional process? So what we have seen in other cases is that involving the people brings about constitutions that are not only more legitimate, but also have a content that is much more progressive. Now, probably the type of divisions with the softliner that have approved, sustained the process is going to be challenged when decisions have to be made on a social democratic constitutions that anyhow is not the social democratic constitutions of the past, but it is a constitutions that has to address issues of social inequalities, but also of gender inequalities and of ethnic inequalities and so on. So maybe Cristóbal wants to go first on this round. Then we will open the floor. I know that Enrico, who has written a book on Chile, will introduce the discussion, but then please tell me if you want to intervene either by using the chat or by using the raising a hand. So Cristóbal, please.
Okay, thank you. These are good questions, which are related at the end of the day to something that we just don't know. So what will happen in the short, mid, and long term? And of course, we can speculate about certain things that might happen. I mean, there are some things that we already know, and there will be an election in April, and this election is for the Constituent Assembly. And we also know how the Constituent Assembly is going to work, in the sense that whatever kind of approval is going to happen within the Constituent Assembly, it should be by 2/3. I mean, these are two important issues that we have to keep in mind. So regarding the elections in April, one of the main tensions that we are seeing at the moment is that the left is extremely divided in very different groups. And as far as I can see now, I think it's very improbable that they will be able to build one common list. If everything goes well, there might be the chance that they put two different lists. That would be the good scenario, probably the Communist Party with others and all the rest, so to say. But this is still a big shot. It might be quite possible, in fact, that we have 3 or 4 lists with different left-wing parties because they're struggling between them. And of course, this will generate not a good outcome in terms of how many seats will be for progressive forces. And on the other hand is the issue of the divisions within the right, as we were mentioning before. We have this tension between softliners and right and hardliners. And the crucial question is, again, will we be able to stay together or not? But even if the right divides itself, the divisions are going to be less relevant, I would say, than in the case of the left. Because at the end of the day, the right will be divided, if that happens, only between one guy who will be the outsider, which is our sort of Bolsonaro or Bossi or Geert Wilders, however you call it, to make the comparisons to the European context, but he's a sort of the populist radical right guy. His name is José Antonio Caz. But he will mobilize a very small chunk of the population. So even if the right splits, I would say, all the others will keep together, who are the ones who are in government. So in this sense, just in terms of the division for the list for the Constituent Assembly, so the right will have like a major possibility of keeping together. But on the top of that, there should be also a list for civil society actors. And it's still not very clear how the civil society actors are going to be composed. And as Julieta, we were talking before, we just don't know what will happen. So my feeling is that because people are fed up with politicians, if there is a list of civil society actors, I wouldn't be surprised if the civil society actors, particularly if there are well-known figures, that might be able to get a lot of seats as well. But of course, this depends a bit of the technicalities. But this is something, again, that we have to keep an eye on how this issue of the election in April is going to work. Something important also is what I mentioned, that the debates within the Constituent Assembly needs to be approved by 2/3. And I think this gives me a lot of hope, in the sense that whatever happens at the end of the day of how this Constituent Assembly is going to be composed, I don't think that we'll have more than 2/3 for something extremely radical, either in the sense of having something even more neoliberal than we have, that it's almost impossible, but in theory you can have that. But also in the sense of someone saying we want to have like Cuba or North Korea or whatever, we don't have 2/3 for that, which means that you need to find the minimum common denominator between these different forces. But again, the worst case scenario would be that they cannot agree. They cannot agree on having the neoliberal version or having Sweden. And this means that they will have something that will say, okay, we'll have a state that maybe will have the chance to intervene on the economy, depending on the majorities in parliament in the next few years. And that is much better than the constitution that we already have. So in this sense, even that minimum change is good news in the sense of trying to move towards something a bit more progressive. And on the top of that, the argument that I mentioned before, that Julieta already mentioned, that Chile is a social movement society. Social movements will not disappear during the constituent process, and they will not disappear the years after. So this means if during the Constituent Assembly, for example, there is this debate about limiting the role of the state in terms of provision for healthcare or whatever, civil society will start to get very active and will start protesting. And even if something like that doesn't go in the constitution and the next government tries to do a reform towards more neoliberalism or opposing social democratic reforms, social movements will be activated. So in this sense, precisely because we have the social movement society, which is driven by these progressive actors from below, I remain relatively hopeful about the long-term perspective of how the country is going to move forward. And the third and last point that I want to make here, as thinking much more in comparative terms, I think that the whole process that Chile is experiment at the moment, I think it's fascinating, in the sense that we already know that if we put the Chilean context in comparative perspective, Chile is well known for the brutal dictatorship of Pinochet, which meant that Chile has one of the more neoliberal systems in the world. So this is very obvious, so to say, and the only equivalent, it's probably the UK in the United Kingdom and the United States, with the big difference that Thatcher was elected in a democratic system, and the same happened with Ronald Reagan, but we didn't have the option in Chile. So, and apparently everybody thought that the sort of neoliberal model works. And in fact, it worked in Chile for a long period of time, but it's a non-option anymore. And I think this is interesting because the whole process that we have been experiencing in the last few years and the constitutional process now, it's an institutional solution for trying to rebuild the social contract. And whatever kind of social contract we will have in Chile in the near future, it will look much more social democratic. And this sense, what Chile is showing to the rest of Latin America, and probably also to other places of the world, is there are possibilities of changing the neoliberal model. By changing the liberal model, again, I'm just saying moving towards something more social democratic. I mean, something like Spain or even Italy would be much better in terms of the social provisions. Of course, someone in Italy or Spain would say, we would love to have something like Sweden. But we are far beyond whatever you have like in Italy or Spain. And what people want is having like a safety net. And Chile is not a poor country. Of course, we are we are not as rich as Germany or the Netherlands, for example. But I think we can think about something slowly and gradually moving into that direction. And I think that's the hope that I have. And again, in a comparative perspective, that will be probably the main lesson that Chile will show to the rest of Latin America and to many other countries. And my hope then would be that in 10 years, we will not be the ones who are exporting the neoliberal model anymore, but the ones who are exporting how to transform the neoliberal model through institutional mechanisms whereby civil society and progressive social movements have been crucial. Because without their support and their presence, we will not be discussing about the possibility of changing the constitution and rebuilding the social contracts into a sort of social democratic model.
Cristóbal, thank you very much also for this optimistic view. And Julieta, on this second round of...
I am happy to share, Cristóbal, optimism. Maybe because, like we were talking before, the bar is really too low. So any movement from the status quo is gonna be an improvement, I'm sure. So the next milestone then is the April elections for conventional delegates. These elections will be concurrent with local and regional governors' election for the first time in the history of Chile. So they're gonna be messy. And unlike the plebiscite, people now will have to vote for candidates like political parties or even independents, but it's not the same as to vote for like approval or rejection in a referendum. So I wouldn't say that many people are looking forward to vote for political options, for political parties. And Chile has been having like high electoral abstention during the past decade. And therefore, turnout had a strong social bias in favor of upper sectors. And this changed a little bit in the referendum, and that's interesting because the referendum during the pandemic, the municipalities where more disadvantaged people live tended to vote more than they used to participate in the past. But it's really difficult to know if we will see this as a trend to continue in April, or we will see now a regression to the mean, having like the upper strata of the society, the power to decide the election. So next election, big question mark. As Cristóbal was saying, we do know that any changes have to be approved by 2/3 of the Constitutional Convention, and I agree with him, that's a good sign. And the big question is, will the government be able to control at least 1/3 of the convention to veto these radical changes? We don't know, because the 78% that approved to change the constitution is not all opposition vote. And many important leaders from the right campaign for the approval option. And it's difficult then to estimate how many of these voters will prefer center-right and conservative delegates. We can safely assume that the 20% that was against of the change of the constitution will vote conservative. But even if there's not a unified list on the right, as Cristóbal was saying, who will they choose? The extreme right that's supporting the rejection, or the candidates running under the banner of the governing coalition? So I think that the fragmentation on the right is also important to add more confusion or uncertainty to the result in April. I think these strategic decisions are really important. and will have an impact on the extent of change that the new constitution will enact, how different it will be from Pinochet constitution. It will be definitely measured against it. If the opposition goes totally fragmented and the right present a unified front, it will be difficult to alter significantly the structure of the state and society. That seems to be the demand on the street, that Cristóbal was saying, with all these claims against multiple forms of inequality. So now we're in the middle of a discussion about pros and cons of unified list, on the right, on the left. And we haven't even started talking about the substantive content of the constitution. And it seems some kind of easier to align right demands in a left-right continuum, right like human rights, gender rights, minority rights, and having the left candidate in favor of incorporating human rights treaties and women's and indigenous people and minority rights, whereas the right will favor the inclusion of free trade agreements, for instance. But it's not so clear regarding the government structure, presidential, parliamentary, semi-presidential system. Will the citizen know which list stands for which alternative? And this is all very uncertain as today. So the next important steps will be to clarify all this for the citizens, to make an informed decision in the April elections, and to define whether the indigenous people will be represented at all in the constitution. The right is afraid that this will give an unfair, quote unquote, advantage to progressive forces, and therefore are trying to prevent the addition of reserve seats. I am optimistic in that. They tried to remove the teeth from the gender parity law, and they were not able to do it. So this is a good prior. And the right is experiencing also low levels of party disciplines in many relevant votes in Congress, and I think this is new for Chile. And we'll see if they manage to stay united and block these reserve seats or not. So it's kind of complicated to elucidate whether we will see a left turn in next November general elections. I think it's true that the constitutional change was not an issue of the right agenda, and several leaders on the right supported the approval, and these are the main figures in public opinion polls. And this is more like Cristóbal expertise, but I feel more confident to say that at least the extreme right was contained. They were never able to capitalize on fear against the social uprising, and for me this is good news. If we were having this conversation a year ago, I was much more concerned that the social uprising ended up creating like this halo of power around the outsider that Cristóbal was mentioned, the Jose Antonio Cas, which is not really an outsider, but is a populist, extreme right fellow. So a year after, I'm kind of confident that at least we can say they were not able to capitalize on that fear. But I'm not so sure that this means that we are like cruising in a steady course of a left side. I guess it depends what we can understand as left. The change of Pinochet constitution is a victory of democratic forces, of progressive forces. And in the sense, it seems that in Chile, once again, the most important social cleavage is democracy and dictatorship, rather than just left and right. So I don't know. I share Cristóbal's optimism. I agree that even if we have like a minimal constitution that says majority rules, if the left wins, they can push forward a more social progressive agenda. If the right wins, they can have more provisions for the market rather than the state. And then we will also have these other, I don't know if I would call them veto players or veto points as the social movement, but we have collective actors, society organized beyond elitist political parties, and I think this is good news for Chile. So I would like to end in this optimistic note and say that I believe that the larger picture from a comparative and regional perspective is that the reversal of the left-wing turn in Latin America was for now, resisted at least in Chile. And I think this is good news.
Thank you very much, Julieta. And before opening the floor to all, I want to give the floor to Enrico Padoan, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Faculty of Political and Social Science of the Scuola Normale Superiore, and has just published a book on Chile in Rivolta, and will open the debate.
Hi to everyone. Thank you very much, both Julieta and Cristóbal, for this great talk. I just want to spend a few words about you. Mentioned that you don't really know, you can't really predict what is going on, but I want to stress that at least Chilean political scientists did effectively predict that something had to happen in Chile. Before or later. I think that in the past 10, 12 years, many advertisements about the incredible contradictions of the Chilean model were evident, and the Chilean scholarship evidenced many times. And I remember, for example, Julieta's colleagues writing a paper on the Chilean party system, was entitled "Notes for an Autopsy." But also Cristóbal worked with Rosana Castiglioni in 2016, in which they stressed the increasing politicization of inequalities and the complete distrust towards politicians by Chilean citizens. It was something self-evident, I would say, and it at least this kind of prediction by political scientists were much more accurate than economists, I would say. So in this sense, I think it's something to be stressed. Also, I would like to hear by Julieta something about the political strategy that Red Politólogas employed to push forward their demands in the political debate. Because Chile, apart from being neoliberal, the other side of the neoliberal model is the dominancy of technocracy. And in this sense, I would say that they exploit this kind of technocratic way of doing politics for progressive purposes. Of course, taking advantages of social pressures and of political resources and political energy coming from below. So, just a few words about the strategies that you employed to lobby. In a progressive sense within the political elites to push forward an outcome that wasn't really obvious at all. So it was a great achievement, and this, in my opinion, deserves some words. Then I don't want to be pessimistic, but I have to put a question about what Cristóbal was saying about the social democratic future of Chile, and in the sense that in Chile, it's true we have a greater level of organization of civil society, but what we lack in Chile is both not so much the fragmentation of the left. Is not that in my view the problem, but it is the complete lack of rootedness of political parties in contemporary Chile. And on the other hand, the lack of organized actors in for example, representing workers, the working class. This is an obvious consequence of the legal system, the legal framework in labor policy that was imposed by the Pinochet Constitution, but we lack both of the structural requisites to develop properly a social democratic model. There is, in my view, different actors, political actors that exploit quite unmediated linkages with their constituencies and I was thinking, for example, about some mayors that in Chile in the last month and years, I would say, are assuming a great political role. And on the one side, this has been good for progressive politics. I think about Sharp in Valparaiso, but in other cases, for example, there is the Osandón phenomenon, which is come from a long time ago, but also recently, for example, during the recent protests, was the case of the Recoletas mayor, who was sent off basically from a demonstration by the demonstrators, and he's a communist politician. So there is, I think, just a complete disarray of the political system of representation in Chile, and this may be a big problem when you will need some social support for implementing concretely progressive reforms in the near future. This is not necessarily it's impossible to do that, of course, but I think that the starting conditions maybe are less promising that may appear at the first glance. This is my personal opinion. Just want to hear about you, about your opinion. And yeah, I leave the floor. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation and for being here to talk about Chile.
Do you want us to respond right away, or should we take more questions? What?
Thank you. Thank you very much. There is also another questions in the chat, which is also, I think, very relevant, and it is which are the main points of divisions between the moderate and the radical flank of the movement. So maybe you can start addressing these questions, and whoever wants to ask questions, you can write in the chat.
Okay, do you want me to start, Cristóbal? Yeah. Regarding Enrico's question about how we managed to do it, I know it was chance, but we were lucky, that's for sure. But we also saw this like window of opportunity. The agreement between political parties to get this vote for the referendum and the Constitutional Convention said that the Constitutional Convention was going to be elected under the same electoral rules than the deputies are in Chile. And we were in a moment of the social uprising also that the Congress had 2% of approval rating. So it was a really, really bad idea to have a Constitutional Convention that was going to be a Congress 2.0. with no women, no indigenous people, no independent candidates. So we started pushing for that. And we also had this kind of what Americans would say, like a blessing in disguise, that the gender legislative quota in Chile that was first used in the previous election in 2017 was really bad. So in a way, the fact that gender quota was bad helped us making the case that we need to change that. Latin American countries have had gender legislative quota since 1991, when Argentina first enacted them. So Chile arrived the last of the countries and did not follow like comparative experience of what a good gender quota is, and they designed a really bad one. They have like a 40% quota, which ended up with 23% of representation. So we used that in a way to managed to get together with other women's organizations from the right to the left, and business women and artists, the actors, the women's actors in Chile were really also active in this. So they help us lobby with that. But then we had this 23% of women in Congress, and we managed to put together a coalition of female deputies from the center-right to the Communist Party, and they all fought for that. And we sat for the first time showing the design in the committee on Constitution in the Chamber of Deputies, and all of the members were mostly men. So the female deputies went down and sat with us, and we started saying, okay, this is really simple. And as it was surprising to know, when you say to men, when women say to men, this is really simple, they don't try to make that they don't understand, and they went for what we were proposing. So I think we managed to go together a broad coalition in the civil society, but we also managed to get a broad coalition in the Chamber of Deputies. And then the media, we had connections with journalists. We were like almost every day in the media, and it was a reasonable request. And I think it was perceived as reasonable. We were able to communicate that we are more than half of the population. We cannot not be present in the redrafting of the social pact in Chile in 2020. And I hope the same luck for the indigenous people now that they are trying to do this, because I do believe that we need a legitimate constitutional convention in order to have a constitution that won't have similar legitimacy problems that the Pinochet constitution has. So I think that was the strategy in a nutshell.
Let me now address the second question or comment of Enrico about the sort of a positive scenario that I depicted that Julieta to a certain extent shared. And you're absolutely right, Enrico, in pointing out there are two reasons why we should be skeptical about that. And the reasons that you are developing are, on the one hand, that we have political parties that are they don't have like strong linkages with civil society. And even the new left that has emerged in the last few years, I mean, it's better than the previous one, but it's still very detached. I mean, it doesn't have like strong roots, for example, at the national level. It might be in certain places, there are some electoral strongholds, as Valparaiso you were saying, but even there, I mean, the level of connected is not that high. And secondly, you rightly point out, labor unions are very weak if you compare that with other countries, but also with the own history of Chile. So if we take these two variables, you're right in saying, well, the scenario is not that good. But I think that the problem of that way of thinking is that this is based on the construction of social democracy in the 21st century. And that's what the literature tell us. If you want to build a social democratic model, you need, on the one hand, strong labor unions, and the second hand, you need like strong political parties that are well attached to the civil society. But I think in the 21st century, asking for that, it's very demanding, because this is not possible anymore. And I think, of course, not in Chile because of the neoliberal model, but I think also in other countries because of how things have evolved in different senses. But there are two reasons why I still think that Chile has like good starting conditions, so to say, for that. One condition is something that Julieta mentioned related to the issue of gender. And this is what she said. It's very interesting. Julieta said, well, what we are demanding is something very reasonable. And the idea that something is reasonable, it has to do with public opinion, or if you want, with hegemony. I mean, just what Julieta was demanding, and many other people, if you ask people on the street, they were saying, it makes complete sense. Why, if women are 50% of the population, they are completely underrepresented in representative institutions? It's nonsense. But this is because Chile has experienced a big change in cultural sense, that Chilean society nowadays is much more liberal than Chilean society 30 years ago. But the same applies to the issue of inequalities. 30 years ago, I remember when I went abroad, I went to Europe for studying. I mean, nobody thought at that time that it was possible to implement a reform of having like free education, tertiary education at that time when I was young. Now I'm pretty old, so it's different. But I came back to my country. The students that I teach, for them was obvious that it's possible to have like free education. So, and something has changed, and this something has to do with public opinion, hegemony, however you call it. So Chilean society has moved into the direction of demanding this sort of progressive value, so to say. And the second reason why I remain hopeful, it has to do with how probably the left is going to act. But even if a right-wing government comes, if the right-wingers are able to win the next presidential election. And this is that my impression, and the literature also tells you that once a government implements or gives certain social rights, you cannot throw them out. So that's impossible. My feeling was what Bachelet, there are many things that we can criticize her, but I think there was one thing that she was very strategic. This is my understanding. I cannot prove it in any sense. But my understanding was in the second government, she said, I want to implement free education for students at the university level. And there is this whole debate about, okay, do it for everybody, only for certain universities. And I think at a certain moment, her point was, do whatever you can pass in Congress. But whenever we grant this right, they will be able to throw it out. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. The reform, if you ask me, is not ideal, but it's much better than that we have in the past. And the way ahead, it's only to improve it. And this is probably what it will happen with this new constitution that we'll have. If there is no big majority for having like in the constitution, like the Sweden model, but probably it's impossible, but the constitution will allow for future majorities to try to build social rights in a slow way, in a gradual way. And this is why I remain hopeful, because even if the right comes to power, somewhat like Joaquin Lavín, for example, he's much more moderate than the other ones, and he will be forced to try to implement social rights and detach from the neoliberal model. That's, again, the two reasons why I still remain hopeful, although you're right, Enrico, by saying that the two other big factors are not present in the Chilean context.
Thank you very much. I have these three questions in the chat. One is about the main points of divisions between the moderate and the radical left. One is about violence by the police, the threats of repression, how possibilities that there would be more repression and that this would trigger more movements. And the last one is about the rights in Chile and I have another one now. Yeah. One is on the presence of a traditional historical conservatism, and the last one is about the importance of public opinion and cultural hegemony, and how did civil society and movements use or access media to influence public opinion, which is also something that reminds me of the important role that public opinion played during the referendum called by Pinochet. So strategies to address this. So I give you the floor for the last round. And you don't have each of you to address all these questions. You can share them.
You want me to start, Cristóbal? I think the repression is still going, and I don't know. I'm a foreigner, so I don't feel that I can say many things. But I was surprised when we arrived in Chile for the level of repression, like everywhere, and against, I don't know, high school students. I arrived in 2011 in the middle of the university student social movement, and I was shocked by the repression and by how, for the media, that was not even an issue. That they show the repression images and say, well, but we need to clarify that the demonstration was not authorized. It's like, what? So that means that the police is going to be able to gas I don't know, 14-year-old students. I remember I was shocked with that. And so I believe that, and the different surveys made by the National Institute of Human Rights show that Chilean society has a high tolerance for, I would say, police brutality, or there are many people that say that torture is legitimate if you obtain information for that. So I believe there's something there that tolerates a level of repression that, for instance, if I compare it with my home country in Argentina, that would not be tolerated. So, but this is changing too. The government is really ambivalent about that. The apologies are half-hearted at best. They don't show like real concern about that, but we have just changed the Ministry of Interior and the head of the police force in Chile, and that was a change. And the new Ministry of Interior is one of these political figures on the right that is more social progressive in a way, and the former one was Pinochetista, was a man from the dictatorship. So that was a change, and I think that this is why now we've seen a removal of the head of the police force that was a demand from the social uprising until yesterday when that was done. So I don't think we will see many changes regarding repression. I think this calls for a total reform of police forces. But even if you see in the south of Chile, the Araucanía, where there's social conflict with Mapuches and what I would call like paramilitary forces of like white people living there, I think that we will keep seeing repression in Chile for at least until the reform of the police forces, or with this government. I think, unfortunately, I'm not that optimistic about that point. And about the right in Chile and conservatism, well, Chile had this strange mix of Catholicism and very strong social conservatism with neoliberal market, with liberal in the economic sphere, and now this is changing, because within the right you have many different opinions, and one of the groups that I think is growing is deeply conservative, is nationalist, is fighting for more control of the state, but also for more conservative society. So I think that we will see more like traditional conservative leaders than we've seen in the past, and that means not only in the social sphere but also in the economic sphere.
Very much. Cristóbal, do you want to?
Yes, thanks. On the issue of the police violence, unfortunately, I share the opinion of Julieta that here I remain less hopeful. I think this is going to be a long-term process. I mean, there is a big necessity of reforming, doing a structural reform of the armed forces, and this has to do with the sort of pacted transition that Chile undertook. I mean, one of the issues that was part of the Chilean transition was like that the military is not really, I mean, the military and police force, etc., there is no 100% civil control of those forces till today. So, and this is, but the good news, I would say, is the right is realizing that this is also a problem for them, because when they can control government, that is the case now, they don't control the police. And this means that if the police is not under control and something goes wrong, this will backfire you. So I think in this sense, there is some hope that in the long-term perspective, I mean, political actors are realizing that it's important to do structural reforms, but again, this will need a lot of time and will not see in the short term any big changes. I suppose some cosmetic changes, but not big changes in this sense. Regarding the question of Roberto about the political right in Chile, I mean, Julieta is right that the Chilean right it's very peculiar in a comparative sense, because if you think about the transition to democracy, the new right that emerged, it was a sort of Republican Party in the sense that it was very neoliberal and it was very conservative on value issues. So to say, that was the Chilean right at the beginning of the 90s. But the point is that many actors within the Chilean right realized that to be competitive, they need to moderate. It might be that they thought between them, probably having like pizza in this posh neighborhood, that they think, oh, the neoliberal model is great and we are against abortion, but they know that this is how they want to win elections. They cannot, because Chilean society has changed. And this is why the political right has been changing in the last few years. And my feeling is that we are seeing on the one hand this populist radical right, which is very extreme, but the good news is that this Chilean right is still combining neoliberalism with the issue of conservative values and having like very strong police. And these three, if that sort of package is attractive for a minor fraction of the electorate, I would say 10%, max 20%. It would be completely different if that populist radical right followed the European standard and they turn out to be welfare chauvinist. If they would say, for example, we want to have like strong police, we are sort of conservative on values, but we want to have a welfare state. But fortunately, this is not going to happen because that right, it's too ingrained, this is neoliberal ideology. And precisely because of that, there is no possibility that they can get more than 10 to 15% of the electorate because the neoliberal model is not what people are demanding on the street. So it might be that through social conservative, you might mobilize evangelicals, etc., but not a big chunk of the population. So, and for me, the crucial question is what will happen with Christian democracy? Because Chile had a very strong Christian Democratic Party that, because of the peculiarities of the transition, always had built a coalition with the center left. But talking to a European audience, it's logical that Christian Democratic parties are mainstream right parties, are not center left parties. And the problem is that the Christian Democratic Party contemporary is divided in two factions, a leftist faction and a rightist faction. So, and I think that probably after the constitution or because of the constitution, whatever, that party will split in these two different factions. And when that happens, there might be the chance of a recomposition of the party system in Chile. And the logical thing will be that we'll be moving towards something like Spain, that we'll have our box, that's Jose Antonio Cast, that we'll get 10 to 15% of the vote. We should have a mainstream right party like PP or maybe PP and Ciudadanos, something like that. And then there will be this debate within the left, and we have like a sort of moderate left and a bit more radical in the sense of demanding certain issues. But I think in the long-term perspective, that's what I think that how the party system would look like in Chile. But as Enrico was saying, one of the problems of that party system is they're not very ingrained within civil society. This will be something that will remain in the future. And the last point is something that Leonardo were asking about cultural hegemony and public opinion. So, and he's asking how is it that civil society and the movement was able to push into that direction? And I don't have a clear answer, but I have a couple of ideas. The first one is that the argument of a movement society started in Chile with the student movement. And this is crucial because students have been very smart in terms of framing and developing frames that are very catchy within Chilean society. And this is why I think they were very, very helpful in the sense of having access to the media because of the sort of frames that they were developing. And also, I think because this is related to this value transformation, I think that on the one hand, we have to think that this cultural hegemony has to do with civil society and with social movement. That's also that we have newer generations, and these newer generations are much more open-minded. This is what all the polls are showing. If you go to World Value Service, Chilean youngers nowadays are much more liberal than their parents. So it doesn't matter if their parents tell them we are against abortion, they will tell, okay, that's what you think, but I am against that. So, and this is this value change, so to a certain extent, change also to penetrate the media in a much easier way. And to put the long story short, I think it's related to these two factors. These new social movements, in particularly students, that they were able to develop frames that were very catchy and accessible to the media. And on the other hand, this argument that we have a generational change and these new generations are pushing for these values at different levels on the streets, but also within families, I would say.
Thank you once again very much. I think that in this short time we have learned a lot. We have learned also about the value and impact of history, so the important role that still pacted transitions, the Bachelet government, the student protest, the neoliberal roots of the radical rights have on a recent event. But we have learned that not everything is path dependency, but there are also critical junctures and ruptures. And that's when constitutional politics meets with contentious politics and with generational transformations, things can change. And I liked the expression by Cristóbal that Chile maybe will export not neoliberalism, but resistance to neoliberalism. And I think that with your mobilization, with Julieta's struggles for representations, I think this can happen, and maybe we can invite you once again in a couple of years to see how this exports of resistance is going. Thank you very much to both of you and to the public, and I hope there will be other occasions soon. And I still have to come to Chile. Keep things going for me. Thank you.